Hi, I'm just making sure that you can hear it from your side.
Joining us this evening, we are in for a treat. Hello everyone, welcome. It is lovely to have you with us this evening. My name is Marge and I'm looking forward to our time together. Now while we're waiting for the program to start,
Yeah, I'm hearing you.
can I just
Yeah.
ask you to please in the chat box just tell us where
Just a minute
you're
long.
from, where you're hailing from. An international panel of speakers, so I'm expecting to have guests from all over the world. So please just drop a note to tell us where you are joining us from. We're all in one room, but we start at different places. So it'd be lovely to see if you can just in the chat box tell us where you are hailing from, so we can give you
All right. I'm going now. So.
Okay. Southeast London, but via Ghana. Welcome. It's lovely to have you.
What I need to do is.
Louise from St. Louis, Missouri. Great to have you. Paris. One of my colleagues is French speaking and French, so he can say hello, but I'm afraid all I can say it's wonderful to have you. West London, West is the best. Fantastic. Thank you for joining us.
Okay.
It's really great to see you this evening.
All right, just a minute.
From Jamaica, Nigeria, via the living room in Cardiff. It's wonderful to have you. You're a traveller, obviously. Now, while we're waiting, as the rest of our guests turn up, I'm just going to ask you to think about, later on you'll be hearing from some fantastic specialist speakers, but just think about anyone you would like to hear further from, so that as the evening progresses, you can drop it in the chat box to tell us who else you'd like us to invite to come and speak with us, and any of the subjects you'd like us to speak on. That will be clearer as we move into the evening. But I know for some of you, it'll be about early afternoon. I know for some of you, you're in very, very warm places, and I'm totally envious. Fantastic to have you with us. Walter Fluker from South Africa, welcome. Thank you for joining us. It's great to have you. I hope you're going to have a fantastic time. In fact, no, I don't hope. I know you're going to have a fantastic time. I'm just checking to see. We've got Fred from Kent, Garden of England. Welcome. Michael Smith from Watford. Watford seems a long way away. I think I'd need a passport. It's all of about 20 miles from where I am. Welcome. For those who've just joined, we're just asking that you just pop in the chat box where you hail from, so we can give you a shout out this afternoon before It's just great to see where you're coming in from, because we do have a panel of international speakers, and it would be lovely to see how international our audience actually is.
Mm-hmm.
Welcome, Sonia from Germany. Thank you for joining us this evening. We'll be starting shortly. Patsy on the line, it's good to have you. Welcome.
That's good. That's good. All right.
Darcy, I'm glad you're looking forward to the event. It's going to be
brilliant.
fantastic. Thank
See you in a
you
bit.
for
Bye.
telling us that. From Mike Allen from Pennsylvania. Great. But you can join us this evening, Mike. Good to have you, Christine. Okay, well, I know that we have others joining us, but let's get started. So hello and welcome. Welcome to Black Pack Critical Conversation, State of the Race. It's great to have you. I've said that already, but it's absolutely fantastic to have you. Now, I've already asked you to pop in the chat box where you're from, but I just want to say that as the speakers continue for the rest of the event, for the rest of the evening, for the rest of the day, depending on where you are, rest of the afternoon, please feel free to pop your questions in the chat box, because towards the end, we will be taking questions, but they will only be taken from the chat box. So please, anything that comes up, just give it a moment and pop it in the chat box for us. Now, we have a feast in store for you this evening. We've got a panel of international speakers, and they are directed by our host, Dr. William Acker. But before I hand over to William, let me tell you a little bit about Black Pack. Black Pack is an organization, a group of Black Christians committed to issues of justice and empowerment. And it was created as a collaboration between the Transatlantic Roundtable on Religion and Race and KRIK KRAK. We host 2 events, and those events alternate on a monthly basis. We have Black Pack interviews, where Black and brown people who are known for particular achievements are asked to delve into their Black Pack and share wisdom and tools. And the other event that we have is the event you're on this evening, today, and that is the Black Pack Critical Conversation, where we address topical and important issues with an expert panel. So welcome, thank you so much for joining us. You are in for a treat. It is great to have you, and I'd like to hand over to William Acker, Dr. William Acker. Dr. Acker is a senior lecturer at the Department of Geography at Birkbeck University of London, the Transatlantic Roundtable on Religion and Race. And that's an international organization that brings together academics, community activists, and church leaders with the aim of tackling injustices faced by people of Africa around the world. William has over 25 years of experience doing community development work in the UK and abroad. Welcome, Dr. William Acker, and I hand over to you.
Thank you, Marge, and welcome everybody, those that are in the Zoom and those that are watching on YouTube. We're really excited to have you with us this evening for our first critical conversation, State of the Race, the African diaspora across the globe. Now, 2020, 2021 has kind of been a momentous year in the lives of African descendants and other global majority people around the world. And as Marge outlined, a group of us came together after what happened to George Floyd because we were concerned about the state of our people and our experience. I wanted to have critical conversations to see how we can move our agenda forward and how our people can be empowered and not be subject to brutality, marginalization, poverty anymore, which has been for far too long quite a bit of our experience. So people were inspired as a result of those events. And one of the inspirations came from our colleague, Mervyn Weir, who's a poet, a playwright, and now an author. And he produced a powerful polemical poem and book called I Can't Breathe. And he also made a video. So I'm just going to show you a little clip of that video so you can get a sense of what inspired us to be where we are this evening.
Please. I can't breathe
His nose is bleeding. Like, come on now.
That's wrong right there with feet on.
Look at his nose.
You see your knee and you got your feet right on his neck. I cannot breathe. I cannot breathe. Use the grown.
8 minutes and 46 seconds of shame that exposes the nightmare in broad daylight of the American dream. Brazen disregard for the sanctity of life. A very public lynching. Strange fruit Floyd. Life hanging by a thread.
Cop with cold contempt for the noble institution of law and order that trusted him to be judge and jury and executioner too. No need for CSI. This crime scene has been seen on every screen the world over. No more undercover cop. This was the hardest diehards to watch.
I can't breathe. A toxic virus engulfs the globe, and no vaccine can save us from its vicious grip. Some say it's a new strain, but it's already claimed millions of lives throughout history. Those most likely to die all have an underlying chronic disease. It's called melanin.
High doses will leave you particularly vulnerable. Black on black, we reject. But blue on black, as we all have read, leaves the brothers dead, unable to breathe. The results have been devastating. On a global scale, people are dying on the streets of this race hate pandemic.
I can't breathe. No.
So hopefully you got a taste of the video, and we'll see another clip of that later. And I know that for many people across the globe, they couldn't help but be moved by what happened and then what it fomented in relation to the Black Lives Matter movement. But for us, because we didn't just want to rest there, we felt that it was an opportunity to begin to have some critical conversations about the state of our experiences and to call on international voices, some brilliant minds across the globe to help us enter into this conversation and dialogue. So we have 4 speakers tonight. I'm delighted to introduce our first speaker, and that's Professor Anthony Reddie. Professor Anthony Reddie is Director for the Oxford Centre of Religion and Culture in Regent's Park College, University of Oxford, and he is also Extraordinary Professor in Theological Ethics at the University of South Africa. Prolific author, which is one of his key latest texts, Theologizing Brexit, certainly a must read. And he's also in the long-standing editor of the Black Theology International Journal, one of the leading journals in the field. So let me stop talking and let us hear from one of our key voices here this evening, Professor Anthony Reddie.
Thank you very much. So a lot of us were somewhat paralyzed with sheer indignation when we saw the sight of George Floyd dying on camera in front of us. I can't breathe. And I guess that central question that came back to us repeatedly was, what is it in the psyche of white supremacy that sees a sentient human being dying in front of you, crying for help, and nothing changes in the actions and the praxis of white power? I think it's important that on this occasion that we put this into a much broader historical context. In the 1770s, 1780s, in the years that preceded the eventual abolition of slavery within the British Empire in 1833, anti-slavery activists, first of all, most importantly, we have to remember that long before white evangelical Christians got on board, people like Thomas Clarkson and William Wilberforce, long before they got involved, it was enslaved Africans themselves who were fighting for their own freedom. And one of their central arguments was that we are sentient human beings. We are more like you as white people than we are the beasts of burdens that you naturally corral on your estates as objects. And therefore, as sentient human beings, we cannot be bought and sold. We cannot be entered into a ledger as if that's our only value. That simply can't be the case. And yet, in order for slavery to be ended, that central argument had to be effectively conceded. That in order for enslaved Africans to be free, inverted commas, because of course, like we know that we were not free, a price had to be put on it. So £20 million was paid to slave owners for compensation for letting their chattel, their objects, go free. So effectively, all the abolitionists had to concede the argument in order for freedom to happen. And I think a crucial thing happened in that moment, which was that we have effectively been objects ever since. We have continued to be chattel. We have continued to be things, not beings. Therefore, once you understand that, then of course it therefore then doesn't seem ridiculous that George Floyd can be murdered in front of us and his pleas end up on deaf ears, because essentially he's not a sentient human being. As we speak, we have the absurdity, and I say it's absurdity, of having a Black Lives Matter movement. And not absurd because the people and all the people who founded it and the various millions across the world who have participated in it, I'm sure many of us in this chat, I'm sure many of us in this Zoom and webinar have participated in Black Lives Matter. That's not the absurdity. The absurdity is even needing a movement in the first place. To have a movement to assert that your life matters when that should be self-evident, that should be axiomatic. To be a human being, to be a sentient being, to have a soul, to be creating the image and likeness of God, as I said as a Christian theologian, is to say that your life matters. Therefore, to have a movement to assert what should be self-evident, and even then it's still contested. It's interesting that there was never a movement for all lives matter, until suddenly Black people said, actually, our lives matter and no more will we stand for being killed with sheer impunity, and nothing happens, there's no redress. Therefore, it seems to me that we are still stuck in a vicious existential struggle for meaning. That we are still fighting just to get to the start line of humanity. That at this moment in time, if you need a movement simply to assert what should be self-evident, that tells you that you're still working from a deficit. And the deficit is not of our making. So this is nothing to do with any pejorative around ourselves. This is to do with the viciousness and the remorseless anti-godlessness of white supremacy. Therefore, we have to redouble our efforts to go back and to remind ourselves consistently that we have never been chattel. We have been sentient human beings created in the image and likeness of God, and in the midst of our blackness, to quote my all-time hero James Cone, that God's divine revelation is found in our blackness, found in our Africanness, found in our black skin, and the very thing that has deemed us to be less than and to be somehow inhuman. So the battle and the challenge goes on. We have to redouble our efforts and strengthen the resolve of our young people to constantly ensure that so long as there's no justice, there can be no peace in this world. One of my favorite aphorisms actually comes from Desmond Tutu, who says, if you think you're too small to make a difference, then you've never shared a bed with a mosquito. I've shared many a bed and many a room with a mosquito. And one of the things you realize is, particularly I found this out with my parents in Jamaica, is that if the mosquito never bites you, just the fact that you know it's in the room means that you never sleep entirely comfortably. And the Black Lives Matter movement, it seems to me, is a constellation of metaphorical mosquitoes that are constantly buzzing around this monstrous white body called white supremacy. And they're simply saying, until you understand that we are sentient human beings, and until you understand that we're not chattel, until you understand that we are not disposable and our lives cannot be simply snuffed away in 8 minutes and 46 seconds, there will be no peace. There will be no peace. That we will never give in and give up until we are accorded what should be self-evident, which is that we stand at the start line with all humanity, and we know that our lives matter, and it doesn't need a movement in order that white power doesn't kill us with vicious impunity. Thank you.
Thank you, Anthony, for kicking us off to a great start there. Our next speaker is Dr. Shelene Gomes, who's a social, cultural anthropologist at University of West Indies, St. Augustine campus in Trinidad and Tobago. She's also Senior Research Associate in Anthropology and Development at the University of Johannesburg. She has a rich range of research interests, including around issues of placemaking, post-colonial religion, migration, and cosmopolitanism. So we're delighted to have you with us this evening, Dr. Gomes. So go ahead, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, William, Dr. Akka. Thank you so much, everyone. I am so happy to be here. I am going to be reading from my screen. So if I may ask you, William, please to use your audio and let me know if I'm going over my time, because I won't be able to see. And so I will start now. Thank you so much, everyone. I am so happy to be part of this inaugural Black Pact Critical Conversation State of the Race inaugural event that brings us together across the Atlantic, if only at this time virtually. If I can talk about a Caribbean perspective on the state of race, it is one situated in the modern histories of capitalism and labor exploitation, as well as the social hierarchies and cultural denigration in the European colonies of the West Indies. These are simply big words to say that there were systematic problems and systems of indigenous, meaning Amerindian or American Indian, as well as we know transatlantic African slavery and Asian indentureship that propped up European extraction in the Americas for centuries. These conditions were foundational to the capitalist plantation economies and societies, with, of course, varied politics and policies, which emerged over centuries in what became the Americas and the Caribbean. I begin with this point, and a lot of big words, but simply to underscore and to say that race, and therefore racism as institutionalized discrimination in the Caribbean, was actively constructed out of transcontinental logic of occupation and extraction. To take a quote from Achille Mbembe, who is in Johannesburg. I draw upon another quote this time, simply to introduce again these ideas that we all are familiar with and that we experience, but to draw from CLR James, a Trinidadian Caribbean philosopher, because he captures so well the systematic entrenching of race in the West Indian colony. In his book, The Black Jacobins, James writes, there were good and bad governors, good and bad attendants, as there were good and bad slave owners. But this was a matter of pure chance. It was the system that was bad. And so this system was not a localized one, confined to a specific place and a specific time, as Professor Reddie has just said, but rather the realization of a dynamic tricontinental economy designed to perpetuate subordination. It was not an accident, maintained by routine acts of extreme violence. And such acts reverberate today, which we have just seen in the KRIK KRAK. And we are well aware of gasps for breath while squeezing out the words, I can't breathe, while under police stop and search procedures, or in Trinidad and Tobago, where I am present now, shoot first, think later policies that we are often hearing in the news, and behaviors along with the hyper surveillance of the poor or the deportation policies of the UK hostile state, as well as the denial of belonging by West Indians of the Windrush generation, who were moving within the British Empire and not as migrants or foreigners, quote unquote, from the Caribbean to the UK, a point which Arthur Torrington has recently mentioned during a talk that I was at the University of St. Andrews with the Windrush Foundation. This is something that I simply had not thought of before. So all these are visible and less than visible examples of the systematic violence that CLR James referred to, as well as the everyday acts of microaggression through which this systematic violence is obvious. So because of my post-colonial vantage, if race has been constructed out of these systematic inequalities, it can be unconstructed, or perhaps a better way to put this would be reimagined through collective action. And so I'd like to take a couple minutes now to consider an example of this hard work of universal human emancipation, the work that we are all in some way or another engaged in, as Stuart Hall once said in an interview, to draw from my work with a Rastafari community in Ethiopia. The first field work that I ever undertook a decade ago was with Rastafari, many of whom had moved from the Caribbean, who imagined themselves as Ethiopian in the image of His Imperial Majesty Haile Selassie I, and who had actually moved to Ethiopia in the pursuit of spiritual freedom. And I am sure some of you know, and some of you have been to Shashamane in southern Ethiopia. So while I have not been back in Ethiopia for quite a few years, I want to give a brief description of what I call Rastafari spiritual repatriation to the symbolic home and homelands of Ethiopia. In my view, Rastafari cosmology, worldview, self-fashioning, is an example of how subordinated groups first envisioned a new way of life and then struggled to make this happen. So building upon an existing ideal of Africa as a form of cultural resistance to white supremacy, everyday Black Jamaicans reimagine the subordinated Black colonial subject in the androcentric image of Ethiopian royalty. Rastafari Makonnen or Haile Selassie I. And this was especially following his crowning in 1930. With this self-fashioning as Rastafarians or Rastafari, Ethiopia became heaven on earth, not the West. The background to this belief stems from Caribbean peoples being well-versed in the Bible, yet another example of the intertwining of colonialism and capitalism that CLR James and many others have mentioned. When the opportunity arose in the mid-20th century to move to Ethiopia and to settle on land that Haile Selassie I had earmarked for the Black people of the world, quote unquote, some Rastafari took up this offer to settle, many of whom arrived in Ethiopia from the Caribbean via established migration destinations in the global north, including England. So in my work, I have argued that a Pan-African cosmopolitan orientation, an understanding of both a global African belonging, a reinvention of self as divine and as worthy, as well as an understanding of global interconnections, characterizes Rastafari worldview as well as the actual migration to Ethiopia. This has led to the making of a multicultural and multi-ethnic Jamaica Safar or Rasta Safar, which simply translates into, Safar translates into neighborhood in Amharic, in Shashamane. This community represents a potent political statement about how the Pan-African social imaginary can actually be realized. This, of course, comes with other problems, but this is the point that I wanted us to, or this is the point that I wanted to underscore. This recovery of dignity and its connection to divinity is done in the wake of the horrors of a long experience of subjugation during colonialism. So this capitalism and colonialism connection is not written from the perspective of the London metropole or any other European metropole, but rather from the perspective of everyday people moving from Kingston to Shashamane. Finally, from my post-colonial vantage in Trinidad and Tobago, I would like to draw attention to these intricacies of race today, both within the Caribbean and within the Americas. While the Americas have shared these socio-historical conditions, the way that race is institutionalized and internalized differs between the US, where persons of color, quote unquote, another terrible term, are minorities, and the Caribbean, where the majority of the population is Black and brown, broadly speaking. In Trinidad and Tobago, this is a largely African and Indian descended population with a lived interculturalism in this multicultural space, as well as rabid racial and ethnic negative stereotypes reproduced, again, by everyday people. During Black Lives Matter and the call to remove statues of white colonizers that we also moved towards and participated in certainly in Trinidad and Tobago, there were also noticeably fewer calls to broach the issues of higher marginal taxes, to examine the role of Caribbean tax havens in maintaining the global racial wealth gap, to pursue mobilization for wealth distribution, or to establish more worker cooperatives, for example, of major industry. So for some in Trinidad and Tobago today, even pointing out how the multi-ethnic Black and brown Caribbean elite willingly adhere to a project of whiteness is resisted. To get into the intricacies of this post-colonial condition, I'm exploring in my work these questions and these issues with the collaborator Scott Timke in our edited volume on race, class, and nationalism in the post-colonial Caribbean. If I can take a few more seconds to end here, I would like to ask you to indulge me for a bit on a bit of autobiography. So growing up in Trinidad and Tobago, Barbados, and Guyana, of quote-unquote mixed race, I often heard anecdotes from my father, who trod in the Working People's Alliance with Walter Rodney and many others in Guyana, about these early days, immediately before and after independence, as well as his later interviews with CLR James in Trinidad, after my father returned to the Caribbean from studying abroad. This appreciation of historical patterns, collective actions toward equality, diversity, and human agency is something that I'm pleased to contribute to today, and continuously in whatever small way that I can. So I will end here. I want to thank everybody for curating a space today where we can do this hard collective work toward universal human emancipation. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Shelene. That was wonderful, such a rich contribution, which I'm sure we will delve into alongside other contributions later. Now we have a musical interlude. I'm delighted to introduce Alexander the Great, Calypsonian, who's going to give us an item at this time.
Thank you. Good evening, everybody. Is it one song or two at this juncture, just so I know?
One at this juncture, then we call
one later on. Okay, thank you. All right. So this song I'm going to perform was written after I saw Mervyn's early unfinished version of the video that you saw earlier. It's called Blue on Black. Every mother who has a baby boy dreams a future for him of love and joy. When he goes to school, he's so clean and neat. All the tanties say the boy looks so sweet. And then he grows and sees that men wearing a blue uniform. And then he grows, will shoot those who don't appear to conform. And then he grows and he begins to experience confusion. And then he grows and now he understands oppression. Blue on black is now the most common attack. Blue on black, a target so easy to crack. Blue on black is a tragedy, that's a fact. Everyone should see blue on black, and no one's baby comes back. No one's baby comes back. Black men these days having a real hard time, often falsely accused of so much crime. Many of them study and work really hard, trying to improve things in their own backyard. And then they fall, and all the boys in blue make their minds up fast. And then they fall, freedom of black men to walk the streets can't last. And then they fall, we know they're all victims of a racist war. And then they fall, because the law is above the law. Blue on black is now the most common attack. Blue on black, a target so easy to crack. Blue on black is a tragedy, that's a fact. Everyone should see blue on black, and no one's baby comes back. No one's baby comes back. To see what's wrong, you don't need to be a sleuth. No Sherlock Holmes required to find out the truth. Breonna and George could have been you or me. A color-coded system of identity. They have a plan to make the country they live in great again. They have a plan to keep keep the wrong people off their gravy train. They have a plan, they block their ears and don't hear the children scream. They have a plan, and only some have the right to have a dream. Blue on black is now the most common attack. Blue on black, a target so easy to crack. Blue on black is a tragedy, that's a fact. Everyone should see blue on black, and no one's baby comes back. No one's baby comes back. With so many murders in just 1 year, it appears there's nothing those blue boys fear. When their guns are drawn, they don't hold their breath. 8 minutes and 46 seconds to death. They let them die, and they don't care if you take a photograph. They let them die, and when they tell the story, their friends all laugh. They let them die, and they don't care who will investigate. They let them die, because by then it's really too late. Blue on black is now the most common attack. Blue on black, a target so easy to crack. Blue on black is a tragedy, that's a fact. Everyone should see blue on black, and no one's baby comes back. No one's baby comes back. No one's baby comes back. Thank you.
The resurrection, the willingness to act for the greater good, to sacrifice for the next generation.
We see progress has always been preceded by protest, and that there's always been a price to pay for freedom. That's why King prophesied, "I may not get there with you." He knew what was coming, but carried on anyway.
What really matters most is what we do next. After we vented our rage, after the last protest is done and the media has all gone, we'll still be here crying for George Floyd, not because he is a hero, but because we are George Floyd.
There but for the grace of God go I, is our silent prayer.
But if we really want change, we cannot only pray. We have to take a knee, as Kaepernick did, before it became the thing to do.
Colin took the knee, and he took his job. Rosa took a stand by sitting down, starting a revolution that is still rolling today.
Mandela took to jail, a long walk to freedom, facing his prison cells for 27 years. Martin had a dream, and they killed him for it. But you can't kill a dream with bullets, if the brothers still believe.
There's a pattern here, and a paradox too. Be prepared to die if you really want to live. What are the chances of a convict on a cross being the sign of victory?
What are the chances of two twinned infections interweaving their narrative arcs on the global stage at the same time?
Double dose of viral impact. So no one can miss the point. The universe is speaking. Are we listening?
All over the world, people are dying from the pervasive persistence of this race-hate pandemic. The atmosphere is toxic. We thought the oxygen was for all of us, but some of us still can't breathe. Black lives matter.
Thank you to Alexander the Great. That was such a powerful item. Don't forget that you can put questions in the chat for all of our speakers this evening. So our next speaker is Dr. Nisrin Elamin, who's Assistant Professor of International Studies at Bryn Mawr College in the US. She's originally from the Sudan, again has extensive research interests around issues of land rights, extractive industries, foreign land grabs, and the militarization of borders in East Africa and the Sahel. Somebody, you've got your mute. Thank you. Okay. As well as being an academic, she spent over a decade as an organizer and activist looking at issues of migration justice, demilitarization, and has worked for a number of community organizations. So delighted to have Dr. Elamin with us. And now over to you, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Thank you all for allowing me to be part of this important conversation. I speak today not as an academic, this is not my scholarly area of expertise, but as someone who's been involved in community organizing around the rights of Black immigrants in the US, and as a member of the Sudanese diaspora who's been following Sudan's ongoing revolution, which is one of a staggering 90 popular uprisings that have taken place on the African continent since 2005. So I'm going to talk to you about Black immigrant lives in the US and about the construction of race and anti-Blackness in Sudan. The organizations I've worked with and supported, including African Communities Together and the UndocuBlack Network, have been organizing for years to challenge the twin invisibility and hyper-visibility, marginalization, and oppression of Black immigrants in the US. In recent years, they've focused their efforts around such policies as the Muslim travel or African ban, the diversity lottery, and other labor and immigration policies. So to answer this question of how much Black immigrant lives matter in the US, I want to offer a few statistics, recognizing that our stories can never be fully captured by them. There are approximately 5 million foreign-born Black people living in the US, which means we represent about 1.6% of the total population of the US. This is a 50% increase from the year 2000. Black immigrants make up about 9% of the US's total foreign-born population, and yet more than 1 in 5 of us face deportations on so-called criminal grounds, and an even larger percentage are detained, often for simply arriving at a US airport or border. We have the highest unemployment rate and are twice as likely to be stopped by the police while driving in comparison to other immigrant groups. Over the last 5 years, only 1% of all US non-immigrant admissions have been from Africa. In comparison, 39% have been from Europe. Anyone who has applied for a visa from an African city will not be surprised by these numbers. One of the primary ways African immigrants enter the US at the moment is through the diversity lottery, which the Trump administration began to eliminate. Of the 50,000 admitted every year through this lottery, 50% are African. Temporary protected status, or TPS, an immigration status extended to people who cannot return to their countries due to natural disasters, epidemics, and wars, has allowed people from Haiti and Central America impacted by climate change and political unrest, from West African countries hit by Ebola, and from East African nations impacted by wars that the US is entangled in, like Somalia, to obtain temporary documents and work permits. TPS was essentially phased out during the Trump administration, putting thousands of Black immigrants, including 50,000 Haitians, at risk of deportation. Considered together, these policies aim to drastically reduce the number of Black people entering the US. This probably comes as no surprise given Trump's use of the term shithole to describe our countries, but it will be important to remain vigilant so that this trend does not continue during the Biden administration. While we are hyper-visible in relation to police and police violence, anti-Blackness has shaped the way that our existence, our stories, and collective power are largely rendered invisible in the media, in mainstream debates around immigration, and even within segments of the immigrant rights movement. Among the thousands of unarmed Black people who have been killed by the police over the last decade or so were Chinedu Okobi, 36, a father and a poet of Nigerian origin who was tasered to death by San Francisco police for running in and out of traffic in 2018. Ousmane Zongo, a Burkinabe arts trader and father who was fatally shot by a police officer while repairing musical instruments during a raid on the warehouse he worked in. And Patrick Dorismond, a security guard and father of Haitian origin, who was killed by undercover police officers after they approached him to ask where they could buy drugs. He was killed because he had negatively reacted to the assumption that he was a drug dealer. Of the people detained, deported, and denied entry to the US under the Muslim ban, despite having secured visas, thousands were Africans, and yet we hear very little about their stories in the media. As someone who was detained under the ban, my story got a lot of attention because I was a Stanford PhD student at the time, and my elite positionality was instrumentalized to demonstrate the exceptional cruelty and senselessness of the ban. But the stories of countless Somali families torn apart by it never made the headlines. In its various iterations, the Muslim ban came to include more and more African countries: Chad, Somalia, Nigeria, Tanzania, and Eritrea. And yet policy advocates have had a hard time calling it an African ban. But if the collective experiences of Black immigrants in the US tell us anything, it is that policies like the African ban are not exceptional, but integral to the ways the US immigration system has from its very inception targeted, excluded, and discriminated against immigrants of color and Black immigrants in particular. What gives me a lot of hope, however, is that it is precisely because our lives are located at various intersections that we are leading some of the most powerful organizing work aimed at challenging white supremacy, xenophobia, and poverty by building coalitions with organizers who are moving us towards divesting from prisons, borders, and policing, while reinvesting in public schools, living wage jobs, accessible health care, and housing. Our experiences reveal the way the injustices of the criminal justice and immigration system are intertwined, and thus call upon us all to consider what it might look like to abolish both of these systems, and to rethink our conception and approach to immigration within the context of imagining a world where Black lives matter. The other brief point I want to make is in relation to Sudan, where an ongoing revolution and popular uprising is not only demanding a full transition to civilian rule after the ouster of a brutal 30-year military dictatorship, but where debates around race and racism are shaping the nature and evolution of this uprising. The construction of race and racism in Sudan is shaped in complicated ways by Arab conquest, the trans-Saharan slave trade, and our particular history of Ottoman and British imperialism. I don't have space to give this justice, but in many ways our unique history of racism predates colonialism, even though it has deeply shaped by it. The irony, of course, is that while the majority of Sudan's population, over 50%, are Black identified, a Northern Arab identified elite has held the monopoly over economic and political power for decades. We can take the genocide in the western part of Sudan as an example of the ways an environmental conflict over increasingly scarce land and water resources between marginalized pastoralists and sedentary farming communities turned deadly, because race was instrumentalized by the state to turn Arab-identified pastoralists into militias that would carry out their political agenda and serve their economic interests. Precisely by targeting, killing, and forcibly displacing Black farming communities off land that was considered valuable and investable. On June 3rd of 2019, the world watched as this same militia was unleashed on hundreds and thousands of protesters who were taking part in a 3-month-long non-violent sit-in in front of the military headquarters in Sudan's capital, Khartoum, to demand a transition to full civilian rule. Over 240 people were massacred that day and 700 wounded. Some of the bodies were later found dumped in the Nile as they floated to the surface. It served as a wake-up call for many in Sudan's capital, despite its shifting demographics, of the persistent state-sanctioned violence that communities in what is today South Sudan, Darfur, and the Nuba Mountains have been subjected to for decades. Armed resistance movements in these regions emerged in response to the state violence after nonviolent resistance was brutally suppressed. Years before this revolution crystallized, young people from marginalized regions living in Khartoum who took part in 2011 and 2013 protests were pointing out that choosing nonviolence as a tactic of resistance is a privilege people in their home regions had been denied. As protesters in Khartoum mourned the martyrs of this revolution, establishing murals with their faces and names on them, they reminded people that the first martyrs of this revolution were the hundreds and thousands who had been killed by the state and its militias in Sudan's peripheral areas over the past decades. They warned against trusting members of the military that were beginning to side with civilian protesters, knowing that some of them had committed heinous acts of violence against unarmed civilians in their hometowns and areas. While the transitional government is more representative of Sudan's population than previous governments, we have a very long way to go to undo the racism that is enshrined in the country's legal apparatus, social norms, and institutional practices. For Black lives to matter in Sudan, we will need much more than a representative government. What gives me hope, however, is that a new generation of youth at the forefront of this uprising is beginning to have these hard and necessary dialogues around race and racism. Many adopted the slogan, "We are all Darfur, you arrogant racist," during the revolution to highlight the state's racist policies. It is these youth and the grassroots organizing that is being led by agricultural laborers, women tea vendors, and factory workers from different regions of Sudan that have the potential to transform our society in ways that the revolution allowed us to begin imagining. Thank you.
Thank you, Nisrin, for a very powerful presentation. Certainly have some questions to come to you in the next section. So our final speaker, last but by no means least, is Dr. Walter Fluker, who is Professor Emeritus of Ethical Leadership at Boston University and Dean's Professor of Spirituality, Ethics and Leadership at the Candler School of Theology, Emory University. A very distinguished scholar over a number of years. Dr. Fluker, I suppose, has the distinction that he's an expert on the two key critical thinkers, I suppose, in the African American experience, Martin Luther King and Walter Thurman. He's held a number of visiting professorships, international positions, and they're sought after on questions of ethics and leadership. So it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Fluker.
Thank you, William, Professor Akar, and to my very brilliant interlocutors, panelists today, and this wide, wonderful, diasporic, exilic audience. Thank you so much. I'll get straight to the point because I know time is not on our side. Some of you know this who are listening. It says, write down the revelation and make it plain on tablets so that the herald who sees it may run with it. I want to read another quick little poem by Robert Hayden. Run, falls, rises, stumbles on from darkness into darkness. And the darkness thicketed with shapes of terror, and the hunters pursuing, and the hounds pursuing, and the night cold, and the night long, and the river to cross, and the jack-o'-lanterns beckoning, beckoning, and blackness ahead, and when shall I reach that somewhere morning, and keep on going, and never turn back, and keep on going, renegade, renegade, renegade. And many of you know the old spiritual deep river. My home is over Jordan. Deep river, Lord, I want to cross over into campground. As a new generation of activists and freedom fighters engaged the long and complex history of race in the U.S. while negotiating the COVID pandemic that has revealed deep systemic issues of state violence and inequities in health, education, economics, demographic location, and so on. Transatlantic activists, religious scholars, theologians, and church leaders must take a good look at the ways in which this new moment calls us to remember, retell, and relive our stories. Remembering, retelling, and reliving our stories of colonization, enslavement, oppression, and quest for liberation involves calling forth creative hermeneutical or interpretive strategies and processes that allow us to return to long memory and history and to reconstruct these defining narratives in respect to futures that can only be imagined. Our imagined futures are necessary because of the ambiguities and contingencies of the present, and they are possible because of the gift of spirit and transcendence, which allows us to stand on the high tower and overlook the complex and jagged contours of history, patiently and waiting for the moving finger to write new visions that enable us to live and struggle authentically in the context of the present. In my 2016 book, The Ground Has Shifted, I raised the concern of contextualization in respect to this threefold method of thinking about and doing theology, ethics, and leadership among U.S. Black churches. I argue that in order for churches to awaken to this new rhythm and time for Black, diasporic, and exile bodies, we must take seriously the shifts of dilemma, exodus, and the frying pan, which for me means political suffering, as in existential hells. We must take seriously these shifts in respect to our long-standing ideological and cultural inheritances. Thus, I proposed a pragmatic strategy of turning from dilemma to diasporas, from exodus to exiles, and from the frying pan to the fire, which I call the baptism of the Holy Ghost. I suggested that the latter, the turning to the Holy Ghost and fire, is far more costly and dangerous than existing in the frying pan. This means that we must accept our heritage and mission to engage our diasporic and exilic conditions and to identify with other scattered and scattering peoples around the globe, Sudan being one of those spaces. I ask my readers to consider a related threefold method, therefore, of congregating, conjuring, and conspiring in commons and at crossings on the future of the Black church in our postmodern quagmire where issues of difference, disjunctive, contradictory discourses and practices dominate our ecclesial perspectives on social justice, change, and transformation. I'll add a quick note there. By that I mean, once I was a white evangelical until I got saved. Those are disjunctive discourses and practices. Finally, I argue that a primary locus or example of how these theological and ethical moments can best be realized is by paying attention to our youth, focusing, making their work central, and joining them and fashioning with them new theological and ethical visions of leadership that extend beyond the sequestered boundaries of U.S. territorialism and loyalties to the state. and to see ourselves as global citizens in a reconstructed world house. Recent movements emanating from the murders of Michael Brown, Sandra Bland, George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, and so many others who are dying in cultural asylums and the jungles planted in them call us to a place of global solidarity in consciousness and action for racial equity and social justice. In my present work, I'm returning to this larger project and arguing again that especially religious scholars and Black church leaders need to begin with the basic consideration that our theological constructions have always been and will continue to be contextual and constructed. That is, they are not fixed. Therefore, we must do theology on the run. Like the herald who is running in Habakkuk that I read earlier, we're called to run errands of resistance that are part of our existence as runaways, and to search for new visions and to read them within the context, at least of what Howard Thurman called the divine context. Yet more is expected of the runner. She must prophesy and publish the good yet disenchanting news that our freedom is going to take much longer than we thought. There will not be a miraculous breaking in an eschaton where all things are gathered up. No, I don't think there will be a magical hand of fate, but because we continue to struggle, resist, reconstruct, and reimagine our futures as we run toward our destinies in hope of our resurrection and revelation as sons and daughters of God. And certainly not just Christian sons and daughters of God, but the whole creation. Finally, I engage in wordplay, that is, playing and privileging the notion of running, as in runagate, a term made popular by the African American poet Robert Hayden. Hayden's 1962 poem Runagate uses Harriet Tubman and the symbol of the runaway to reveal the dangers, determinations, terrors, crossing, moves, strategies of enslaved Africans who escaped the master's house in pursuit of freedom, both freedom of the body and the liberation of consciousness for the birth of new subjectivities, new persons, running away from and running to something strange, not yet realized, but imagined as new futures, new situations, new beings, new ways of interpreting the world. A world where one is saved from the horrors of enslavement of the body, mind, and spirit. I take my cue from speculative fiction, the work of transatlantic Afrofuturists and sci-fi writers and artists, whom I identify as running watchers that seek to address our situation. The contemporary fascination with remembering, retelling, remixing, and reliving old stories with imaginary futures is a critical task of Afrofuturism, and I think of the church, religious scholars, and activists. Take, for instance, the success of Black Panther, Watchmen, A Lovecraft Country, and the ways in which these film stories take a look at long memory and history and reconstruct narrative strategies that speak to our present. To use the language of the late Richard Ibton, Afrofuturism is the search for the Black fantastic, a genre that destabilizes, at least momentarily, our understandings of the distinctions between the reasonable and the unreasonable, and reason itself, the proper and the improper, and propriety itself, by bringing into the field of play those potentials we have forgotten or did not believe accessible or feasible. The late Octavia Butler's 10th novel, Parable of the Sower, is one of those reconstructions that allow us to reimagine our futures ways in which we interrogate constructed rationalities and become renegades to Black futures and return to the present with lessons for adaptability, change, and pragmatic strategies for liberation from the bonds of consciousness. Butler's work is only one example of the running, watching, prophetic task to which we are called. I'm aware of time, and I am a Baptist preacher, so I just kind of wetted my throat for you for a few minutes. But I'll stop here, and I'll be so happy to engage in conversations on congregating, conjuring, and conspiring in commons at the crosses. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Fluker. Very melodious and meditative talk. Now I want us to enter into dialogue between us, and then we'll take some questions from the chat. So, I think just my first question to Anthony and Shelene. Just, there was a kind of joining in your talks around this idea of racial capitalism. But I suppose I want to ask, to what extent, when you think about that idea historically, to what extent then does that create the ground for coming together across transatlantic space? Or to what degree are these then local struggles? So is there a sense in which one can combine and unite around Black and brown issues, or actually are these issues very local? What's happening in Britain and Europe is quite different to what's happening in the Caribbean region. So Anthony and then Shelene, either of you. Here you go.
Okay, yeah, I mean, I think we have to think of this as a global struggle, and we have to think of it as an interconnected struggle, and we have to think of this very much within the context of a embedded form of monopolistic capitalism that has created these tentacles that finds different ways of pitting different groups against each other. So I think even the nature of the question itself, with all due respect, is part of the problem, because obviously what empire always does, it always pits those groups against each other, so they're fighting for the scraps and never seeing that actually ultimately there's an overarching hand to this, which is a hand of white supremacy that has colonized, taken resources and imprisoned peoples both spiritually and materially, and continues to do so, and then feeds a lie that basically essentially that what we have to do is to fight each other in order to get our little bit from what is a corrupt system that never had our best interests in mind in the first place. So what we have to have is a serious act of deconstruction. So, for example, one of the ways in which I think this form of sort of neoliberalism plays us off is on the basis of individual virtue. So most of us in this room are successful. I mean, that's why we're here. We're here because we've navigated our way through a system in order to become educators, to become academics, to become leaders. Part of the myth, of course, is that once we achieve that, then what the system then wants us to believe is to say, well, of course, there's nothing wrong with this system because, of course, Walter Fluker can make it, Dr. Gomes can make it, Dr. Elamin can make it, Dr. Aki can make it, Anthony Reddie can make it. Clearly, everyone else are just not trying hard enough. Whereas the fact is, systems, which is not to take away the individual achievements that we have made, but actually systems are always good at allowing a certain number of facile clients to make it through while still overarchingly controlling a narrative and a system that despoils and renders the majority as objects. And therefore, what we have to focus on, always keeping in mind, is that the system will try and make itself to be so self-evidently normal and normative and axiomatic that somehow what it wants us to believe is that there is no alternative. There is always an alternative, and we have to keep the vision open that says that we will not buy the lie that says that this is somehow how God intended it to be.
And thanks, William. There are two things also that I would like to add to that. That one is one of the reasons why I keep going back to Mbembe's quote about the logics of extraction and occupation is that precisely to emphasize what Anthony has just said. That one, historical conditions are important to understand. Two, that these are systemic and systematic processes of constructing groups, and then are then internalized and reproduced. And then the second thing is also that one of the reasons why I like anthropology, and probably why I was interested in it early on, is because it tries to understand local conditions, local situations, local experiences, and from an emic perspective, whatever the complexities of that may be, from an insider perspective, what's happening there where you are, and then how do you connect with other people around the world or in different geographies or people who you think of as different. Today we talk a lot about cultural diversity and cultural difference, but whomever these others are, how do we then think of them not in a hierarchical way, but as equal human beings? And how do we find ways to then challenge and resist injustices that are systemically and systematically being reproduced? And so that's why also I lived out of the Caribbean for many, many years after I grew up here. In different English-speaking countries. And so one of the things I was really astounded at when I moved to Trinidad a few years ago was that the kind of negation of an existing or the post-colonial extraction that's going on today. So it's always it's not always, but there's a very dominant narrative that it's the past that's solely responsible. There's no sort of inequality today that is being perpetuated by an elite today. And so I think this is also one of the things that dovetails with Anthony's comment about this divide and rule tactics that we then, or subordinated groups or groups that have historically been subordinated that are now in power, then reproduce and perpetuate. Thank you.
Thank you. Move to Nisrin and Walter. So kind of a similar question in a way. The degree to which then, because a lot of the focus has been on George Floyd, historical racism. So the degree to which can that speak transatlantically, or does it miss some things? And again, if we are thinking about, does a Christian history, transatlantic enslavement, black church, when you think about that imagined future, can that speak across our global African diaspora, or are there things missing that we need from other traditions, other elements? So
I privilege. Is it Nisrin?
Yes, I'm still trying to sort of figure out how to answer that question. It's a very good one. I think I'll say that in my own work, I look at Gulf, so Saudi and Emirati foreign land grabs in Sudan, and at community resistance to land grabs. And in that work, I've been struggling to theorize that relationship between the Gulf and many countries in the Sahel, where a similar kind of extractive, land dispossession, etc., the kind of logics of capitalism are at work, and yet there isn't that same, you know, this is not a European colonial relationship, right? And so I'm just trying to think through how can we talk about other kinds of hegemonies, other kinds of histories of exploitation outside of the frame of kind of European colonialism. So I'll offer that for now.
Thank you very much. And it's important for me to think of, I love the language of post-colonial extraction. It's just, it almost says it all. And we are participants in the post-colonial extraction, internalized logics that bring us to places where we cooperate with our own destruction. And so part of that's at stake when we think theologically, which I was suggesting. And so for me, part of the work that goes forward, because the ground has shifted, so much of what we've done in the past, these old logics, are not only impractical, they're destructive. And so what would it mean then for to congregate, to take this language seriously, of coming together in our difference maybe, and in our contradictions, and engage. And when I write about this, congregating for me has an accent on the elders learning to listen to what has come to them by way of the youth, of the young, who are bringing us to some different kinds of possibilities, imaginative futures. So one of the reasons I think we look at Afrofuturism as one of those sites is because it is the Black fantastic. And it does allow us, when we congregate, to conjure. That is, to bring together those disparate things that we thought did not fit, and that maybe are quote unquote bad, evil, or sinful, and do a remix. So while we congregate, we conjure, we also conspire, not simply in the ominous sense of that word, but to breathe together, maybe for the first time. Old men like me love the idea of breathing new life. I'm not the distinguished Professor William. I'm called the extinguished professor sometimes. But the idea is to, how do we breathe together and conspire? Theologically, I like language like the Holy Spirit. There might be other symbols, but I love the idea that we might experience a fresh breath of Pentecost when we congregate, conjure, and conspire as we cross into dangerous territory. There is so much at stake, I think, in these kind of conversations, which are illustrations of this idea of congregating, conjuring, and conspiring.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you all. Some of it kind of reminds me of that kind of idea about Sylvia Winter is around the reconceptualization of the human. You know, actually, are we at the way these societies are operated for us? Do we need to kind of reconceptualize how we think about ourselves, and like you say, and really conjure and do the trickster and overturn some of these notions that have so driven us. Marge, I think we've got some questions from the chat that Marge Lowe is now going to ask.
We've got a couple of questions, William. I'll throw out. The first one was actually directed towards Anthony, and it says, how would you, from the Black critical perspective, deconstruct the colonial matrix of power? I've got about 4 questions here, so I'm going to just take them. I was going to pull some of them together, but I'm just going to put them one on one very quickly so we can try and run through them, because I'm keeping an eye on time also. Yeah.
Yeah. people do sort of PhDs on this stuff, so trying to if to summarise it in a few lines, I think it's going to be difficult. I mean, I think essentially one can never underestimate the significance of critical thinking and analysis. And actually, I think one of the gifts that we've been given, and it's important to remember, it comes from a black woman, so Beverly Crenshaw, in terms of intersectionality. So what she has given us is the importance of not just thinking in binary ways, but thinking in ways that are helping us to think intersectionally, which is why we need this kind of conversation with people from a whole set of disciplines. Actually, one of the problems, I think, with theologians initially was that because we saw our discipline has been at the the queen of the sciences, that we thought that actually because that we were engaging in the deepest forms of metaphysical thinking that somehow we had the answers. So basically everyone sort of came to the theologians because the church effectively ran the world for many, many years. That was an utter fallacy on our part in terms of arrogance, because actually what we needed was social scientists, we needed anthropologists, we needed social scientists, we needed economists, we needed people from a whole variety of perspectives to say, how then do we become the village where the brain's trust is there, where we help each other to see the things that we can't see? Actually, one of the only intelligent things I think that Donald Rumsfeld ever said was this thing about known knowns and unknown knowns. You know, it is difficult to assess what you don't know if you don't know it. Therefore, I think the importance of reasoning. So one of the things I remember growing up with was that the elders would congregate in the front room of my parents' home. So notionally what was happening was, and certainly those from a Caribbean background will know partner, too long to explain it. Basically, a form of credit union. So black people would save amongst ourselves in the days when banks wouldn't give us money. And so my mother was a banker. So people would come by the house. Not ordinarily, all they were doing is just coming in to put in their portion of money into the pot, so that every week someone got a collective amount that would enable them to get a deposit for a mortgage, or to buy a house, or to send children to school, buy uniforms, whatever. But actually what happened was, in that simple act, people never just came, gave them money and left. They came and they sat down, and there was some deep conversations, which looking back was actually analysis. They were saying, okay, this life in Bradford is hard. How do we get through it? And everyone chipped in with their opinion. If those people who were supposedly unlettered people, not schooled, can do that, then that's what we need to do. And effectively, that's what we're doing this evening, is to sit down and to say, well, let's pool our knowledge. There's no one person as great as Walter is, you know. I mean, I remember meeting Walter and Sharon a number of years ago and think to myself, my God, I wish I could be as smart as they were. Seeing how wonderful, seeing how wonderful they were as a holding court at the Fund for Theological Education, the FTE in America. But as smart as Walter is, I think even Walter's smart enough to know all of us need a collective family around us that helps us to see what we can't see. And there has to be that way in which we move forward. So I've noticed in the chat box a few people have been critiquing the false consciousness of prosperity teaching. Prosperity teaching is a form of neoliberal individualism that says, actually, if you give your money to the pastor and you make a covenant with that individual, then God will bless you. There is no individual blessing. The blessing has to be for the whole of humanity, and particularly for all of our community, where we come together intersection.
Who's next?
Thank you very much for that one. So I'm going to the next question. William, I'll speak it to you and you can decide. It says, imagination has been mentioned by most of the speakers. How effective do you see the imagination working for progress in our complex world?
Shelene, do you want to take that one?
Sure, thanks. So I think outside of all the long philosophical debates about imagination, I think each of us in some way or another today and I see also some comments in the chat, but have talked about the power of the imagination, whether it's youth collective action, whether we're in the Caribbean against gender-based violence, or for Black Lives Matter throughout the world, or in the Sudan against neocolonialism. This sort of collective action is something that also, I keep going back to the LRD, but because his book, The Black Jacobins, was for me so pivotal, when he talked about how through, and someone mentioned it in the chat box, through the lived experience of subordination of slavery in Saint Domingue, people imagined themselves as free and as equal, and they did something about it, right? And there was revolutionary action. And so whether or not we agree with mass scale revolution, or we take a more reformist approach, that kind of collective action is something that I still think can help us to move imagination and imagining to new conditions of equality. So for me, in my work, something very simple as having students say, oh yeah, I didn't think about how extraction and how race was constructed historically, and what that has to do with the negative stereotypes that my family reproduces about people who are seen to be of another ethnicity, right? Or in the case of Rastafari, who have literally moved because they've imagined themselves as equal and as divine. So I'm just going to stop here in the interest of time.
Thank you. Yeah, go ahead.
May I just suggest that for me, there are usages, plural, of imagination. And the imagination I think we need for this time takes seriously materiality. It takes seriously history and the stuff of history which has been given to us. That's what I mean by cultural and material inheritances. So imagination becomes a very important tool in reconfiguring and meaning making. And it also provides us opportunity to participate in what I'm calling conjuring, taking old things, thrown away things, despised and desacralized Black bodies, and working to bring them to health and wholeness. These are feats of imagination wedded to reason. I'm not fantastical in that sense, but wedded to reason, but taking the body itself. Had I been asked to respond to the question given to Anthony, I would have added that the body, for me, is the site where we begin to do the work. This critiques the notion of some kind of godly, spiritual, amorphous thing that we're involved in. Rather, it has to do with the location. So if I'm in Sudan, my God, I must know my body and the history that has brought that body to where it is. And then imagination allows me to engage this historically, and not in some fantastical other world where I cannot change that. Long response. I'm sorry. Long response.
That's fine.
Never enough time.
We've got time for one more, Martin.
We've got time for a couple more. William?
One more.
Okay. Specifically to Nisrin, and it's so I'll share that one. It says, how is Arab-centric racism and post-slavery hegemony similar to and different from the Eurocentric form?
Yeah, that's also an excellent question. I don't know if I have enough time to give it justice, but I would say that it's partly what is complicated in Sudan is that we have a kind of layering of oppressions that end up, that people have now risen up against, if you will. And so I think what is complicated is that the language, the vocabulary that we have to speak against against anti-blackness that is driven by sort of Arab hegemony, if you will, in scholarly circles still is very much within a kind of US-centric frame. And so I think we're just starting to have these conversations, and I think that we're trying to create new language for it. But one thing that I want to say, and sort of to bring everything together that I've heard here, is that to me, we really need to look at the uprisings that are currently happening on the African continent. I mentioned earlier that there have been 90 such uprisings over the last couple of decades. They rarely make the headlines, and yet we're seeing some really inspiring organizing that is not only geared towards overthrowing governments, but about challenging this global system of capitalism, and the kind of individual sort of notions of what it means to like, I think freedom is a collective thing, right? It's a collective journey that we're all on. And to me, we have to start forming these kind of global connections between movements across the African diaspora in order to recognize how powerful we actually are. So that is kind of where my hope lies, is in the youth who are leading these uprisings, that we can draw lessons from, even for our own organizing here in the United States.
Thank you, that's a powerful point. Just want to give, we're going to finish at 9:50, 9:20, so forgive us just going over 10 minutes, but just want to give our speakers just one last opportunity. There's something in the chat about what is going to be the action. So we've had the theory, and I'm sometimes kind of reluctant almost to ask that question because life is complicated, isn't it? And that's why we're having the dialogue. But maybe, I suppose, what lesson would you want the audience to take away? Given that it's a mixture of, there are some academics, but a lot of community people, a lot of ordinary people, and in their minds, they always think, I've come to a talk, I want a solution. So what advice would you give them this evening?
I would say very quickly that we must reject mind-body dualisms. Mind is not a divorce from action. In fact, mind may very well be one of the things that the body takes along with it. So engage, resist, but think as you go. And that may be one of the most wonderful things that we can do at this point, is to reject dualistic interpretations of human beings.
Great, thank you. Shelene?
Thanks. I don't have anything quite as profound, but I would say talk to people. Just talk to people. Just one of the things also that we see today with increasing neoliberal capitalism and the kinds of egocentrism that characterizes all of us wherever we are, is that we often don't reach out, or simply, whether it's through a nod or through a simple hello, we don't as much perhaps as we might have even 20 years ago. So just talk to people, and if somebody rejects you, if they say that something you don't like, don't take it personally. Again, it may sound somewhat contradictory and really simplistic, but just simply exchanging information, learning, understanding about different worldviews, and how we can create that cross-cultural understanding, for lack of a better term, towards collective action, so that we can have we can realize universal human emancipation. I think just talking would be a good step.
Thank you. Anthony?
Yeah, basically join and become part of social organizations. I'm not going to say what they should be. I think that's for every individual to find what that is, but there are a plethora of issues that we know exist both locally in our communities and more broad in terms of international issues. And how the system sucks us into a kind of lethargy and inertia is by believing that it can't be changed and it can't be defeated. And of course, that's a myth. It can be, but it's not going to sue for peace anytime soon. And so therefore, it's about, well, so what difference can I make by joining with others, maybe identifying where my particular gifts and passions lie? So let's take one very simple example. All of us know that one of the critical things is education, and education of our youth. And we know that the state to which we pay our taxes never educates our children in the way in which it was set up for, particularly for white elite young people. But therefore, one of the things that I have to say to many parents is, it's not the most glamorous work in the world, but become a school governor. If your child's in a school, get a stake in the school by getting on the governing board, and then you can hold the teachers and the curriculum to account from the inside. It may not be the most glamorous work in the world, but we know that schools largely get away with what they think they can get away with. If you hold them to account and make them accountable, because it's our taxes that pay for that service that we don't get, then that is just one piece of action. It's not the only solution by any means, but all I would say is join social organisations. And final thing I'd say is of course, like the biggest social organisation we have has always been the church. And therefore, if you're part of a church, begin to ask the leadership, what are they doing to engage in these social activities? Because as Walter said, that our faith is not just a abstract, spiritualized, non-embodied reality. It is bound up with our very being. And therefore, if our being and our bodies are being disregarded, then we are being disregarded. And we have to find ways of engaging in those types of solutions. And our faith should be a part of that. And therefore, churches should be a part of that. But not just church, other social organizations as well.
Just to add on to what Dr. Reddie was just saying, I think part of the beauty of collective action is that we find ourselves engaging in something that is greater than us. And so for me, I think of, for example, the Black Lives Matter movement in the US connected with the Sudanese revolution early on during the revolution, and brought encrypted phones and laptops to youth leaders on the ground. And that, to me, gave me a lot of hope, because there's a globalizing that is happening outside of this neoliberal, sort of globalization, if you will. And on that, I want to say that I want to warn against this neoliberal Africa Rising narrative that is all about investing in Africa, free trade, basically capitalism with a friendlier face. To say that instead of doing that, I think we need to support social movements on the ground and learn more about them. What are they doing? What are people doing in their own neighborhoods, at the sort of grassroots level? And so to me, yes, I think it's about engaging where you are, right? There are many people who are organizing in the US to divest from prisons, as I mentioned, to divest from policing and from border militarization, and to reinvest in our communities, right? The Black Panther Party was right in saying that we need to have community control over our schools, over our healthcare system, etc. And I think there are ways to do that. We might not see where the end goal is, but the beauty of collective action is that we begin in the process to imagine a different world as we're walking, right? Make the road by walking, essentially. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you to all our speakers for really profound and engaging debate tonight. Couldn't really think of a better way for us to kick off our State of the Race conversation. So deepest thanks and gratitude to all of you. We heard our brilliant Clipsonian before, so just before we close and just make a couple of announcements, we'll hear from him again. So over to you, Alexander the Great.
Thank you very much. Very inspiring and interesting evening. This song is called Remembering Slavery. was written in 2007 after I heard William Hague praising Wilberforce. Not got a problem with Wilberforce, but I thought this is such an untold story. History seeks to elevate people like Wilberforce. He had the slave trade abolished, we know of course, but give credit to those of the African race. Toussaint and Equiano with no amazing grace. Haiti was the jewel in the Caribbean crown. Napoleon fought Louverture but could not bring him down. And Gustavus Vassa wrote a true slave story. How come it's an English politician gets the glory? This is a year for remembering slavery. Yes, it is the history of Europe which is most unsavory. Not only politicians, but black people's bravery is what brought about the ending of slavery. When World War II ended, the French liberation was marked by a victory parade for the nation. The ruling powers met and made a decision. Paris would be freed by an all-white division. 60% of their army was African, 250,000 Algerian and Moroccan. But Churchill and Eisenhower agreed to the plan. France would not be saying thanks to any black man. No, this is a year for remembering slavery. Oh Lord, the history of Europe that is most unsavory. Not only abolitionists, but black people's bravery is what brought about the ending of slavery. In the media, a new row has erupted, showing how young people's views can be corrupted. A rich teenage girl on a reality show expressed her regret that slavery had to go. This is no longer just a matter of class. When we allow these kinds of comments to pass, you find right-thinking people at every level, happily improving on the work of the devil. This is a year for remembering slavery. Oh Lord, the history of Europe that is most unsavory. Not only politicians, but black people's bravery is what brought around the ending of slavery. It's what brought about the ending of slavery. Thank you.
Thank you, Alexander the Great. Really appreciate both items.
My pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you. So we're nearly at an end. I just need to make 2 plugs. So tonight was, as I say, was inspired by Mervyn Weir's poem "I Can't Breathe," which is now there's a video which you saw, but there's also an illustrated book, beautifully illustrated and put together, and that's available for purchase via KRIK KRAK Media. So I think somebody will put it in the chat. It's not in the chat already. So please purchase that book, make a contribution to the solidarity of the cause. And then just to announce that next month will be the next in our series of Black Pack events, and as you can see there, our next will be a interview and dialogue with Jason Arde, He's an associate professor of education at University of Durham and has a fascinating life story. Didn't read until he was a teenager. So please come out Saturday, 27th of March, and learn what is in Jason's Black Pack. So again, further information will be available on the KRIK KRAK website, and we will send out information to everybody that registers. So thanks once again to all our contributors to a very powerful start to our critical conversation. So next month we'll have the Black Pack interview, and then in April, the end of April, we'll have our next critical conversation. So thank you all, and good night, everybody. Have a great evening and a great afternoon, I think.
Yes.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. It's been a wonderful event. Thank you so much. Thank you, all the speakers. It's been absolutely